Excellent. All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. On behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at the University of Washington, Tacoma, I'd like to welcome everybody back to today's installment of our fall seminar series, Making Trouble. And today it's an absolute honor to welcome our speaker, Dr. Michael Goldfield, who is a political scientist, an author, a labor activist, and a former student activist. And he's joining us today from Detroit, Michigan, where he's currently a professor of industrial relations and human resources in the Department of Political Science at Wayne State University. Prior to his academic career, Goldfield worked with the Students for a Democratic Society and later with the Sojourner Truth Organization, where he was a founding member and part of the organization's Westside branch. He's written dozens of articles and a number of award-winning books covering the decline of union density in the United States, how progressive politics in America have been stifled by racism, and the political origins of the New Deal. His lecture today is going to explore the topics covered in his latest book, The Southern Key: Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and the 1940s, which was published just this year by Oxford University Press. So please join me in giving Dr. Michael Goldfield a warm round of digital applause. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your time, your experience, and your expertise.
Alex, thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, even if only remotely. My book, The Southern Key, focuses on the South and Southern labor struggles in the 1930s and 1940s. A seemingly obscure topic, perhaps, like Civil War reenactments, perhaps only of interest to hobbyists. But I'm here to tell you that this is not the case. And I want to suggest that the fate of Southern labor organizing during this period is the key to understanding America today. And since this is the day before Election Day, I want to suggest that this helps explain to a good deal how we got to Trump and American politics as it is today. And the South's also arguably, I would suggest, the key to all of US history. So that South has been a distinctive, atypical part of the United States, but it's also, however, America writ large. And the bedrock of this understanding begins not with the culture or social history of the South, but with its economy and the racial social relations that have sustained it. W.E.B. Du Bois, perhaps the most penetrating and, in my opinion, the greatest American social scientist of the 20th century, understood this well. Du Bois argues that the question originally posed of why no socialism in the United States, by which he meant no party, electorate for a significant party representing working class, whether it be labor, socialist, social democratic, or communist, that question really reduces to why no liberalism in the South. The South, according to Du Bois, was inherently reactionary, so there could be no successful third party movement in the country as a whole until the South changed dramatically. So this story begins in colonial times, first with the development of tobacco and sugar crops, later cotton, all produced initially with slave labor. Here I wish to probe the more recent period, almost a century old, and it's particularly the failure in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s of labor to fully unionize the main Southern industries, whose success, I argue, had the potential to radically transform the South and thus the nation as a whole. And this plays a central role in understanding where we are today. And I also argue in the book that this failure to unionize the South was not at all predetermined at that time, and it's certainly not predetermined today. So the legacy of slavery and white supremacy have left a callous disregard of human dignity and the sanctity of human life. I have a PowerPoint here. Let's see if this works. It's reflected, among other places, in the distribution of death penalty cases No, let's see. Is that visible to everybody? Okay, good. So over 80% of the 1,460 death executions since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976 have been in the South, with over half in 3 states alone, Texas, Oklahoma, and Virginia, where it's probably not going to be taking place much anymore. This lack of respect for human life is itself the heritage of African American slavery and the plantationist system. And one interesting factoid that I came across is that this type of violence and lack of respect for human life affected white people too. So in the 1850s, the murder rate in Georgia was 100 times greater among whites than it was in New England. White people killed each other. The NRA says guns don't kill each other, but most of it wasn't with guns, but some of it was with axes, whips, hammers, stones. And this is a reflection of the demeaning of human life. Low levels of social support for those in need, be it children's health care, unemployment insurance, workman's compensation, disability is perhaps also reflective of these attitudes. As the slide here shows, the lowest level and lowest support for public education, healthcare exists in the South. In 2015, 17% of Texans had no health insurance, Texas being a fairly affluent state, and almost twice as much as the national average. The South continues to this day to have the lowest level of unionization, the most anti-union labor laws, and the most egregious violations of workers' safety. And I would argue that this low level of unionization is in good part the reason for so much ignorance and superstition. Lack of working class organization leads to atomization, individualism, and increased receptivity to manipulation by dominant economic interests. As a result, the South is the region where the largest percentage of people are birthers, those who believe Barack Obama was born someplace else beside the United States, reject evolution, and deny the existence of global warming. So, and the South is the place where Donald Trump has had the most support, especially among white people. So none of this is to argue that the South is all bad. It's recently the site of many great universities and research centers, some of which produce far more African-American PhDs than institutions in the allegedly more liberal and racially tolerant North. And it's also the area where some of the country's most valiant popular struggles have taken place, including those mentioned in some of Mike Honey's works, particularly his book on Memphis. The interracial labor battles of the 1930s and 1940s and the 50s and the 1950s to 1970 civil rights struggles taking place in the South have been an inspiration in the last century. Nevertheless, the South remains, as Du Bois so poignantly argued, a distinct reactionary region of the country, and this has been the case since colonial times. There are a number of myths which I try to debunk, starting with those about Southern culture. A lot of this promulgated in the sociological literature that attributes low levels of unionization in the South to attitudes and culture of Southern workers. Workers there are allegedly too individualistic to subordinate themselves to collective organization. But during the 1930s and 1940s, as industrial workers across North America organized, Southern workers also organized. Let's see, we've got here. And I want to highlight one surprising area where they were especially strong, the state of Alabama, presenting this something as a counterfactual to difficulties in the South. So Alabama, along with Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia, was the heart of the Deep South. Controlled by Black Belt plantation owners and their industrial allies in Birmingham, voting for the white supremacist and racist states' right Dixiecrat presidential candidate Strom Thurmond of South Carolina in 1948, fervent supporters of overtly racist Governor George Wallace in 1964 and 1968, Alabama seems an unlikely place for interracial liberalism and radicalism to take root. The state was as gerrymandered as any in the South in favor of white cotton plantation owners, enshrined in the 1901 Alabama state constitution. Yet in 1946, when the CIO endorsed left populist James Big Jim Folsom was elected governor, the ever optimistic nation declared Alabama the most liberal state in the South. Folsom was perhaps a bit unique, but he was not alone in Alabama, which had a history of electing pro-labor and more progressive people. So Folsom, in contrast to most other Southern governors during this period, argued for more opportunities for African Americans. He explicitly stated, quote, race was a phony issue, a ploy used by the rich and powerful to divide poor people and blind them to their own interest. He opposed the poll tax. He argued that all African Americans in Alabama should have the right to vote. He made a point of welcoming African Americans to his campaign rallies, shaking hands with them, etc. And as the storm of white backlash swept across the South, including Alabama, Folsom, who had been elected for a second term in 1954, invited the flamboyant African-American Harlem Congressman Adam Clayton Powell to the State House, had a limousine pick him up. At the airport, was photographed in the governor's mansion drinking scotch with him. So I'm not suggesting that Folsom was a militant civil rights activist or consistent integrationist, but merely he was well outside the Dixiecrat consensus that ruled much of Southern politics. So why did Alabama at this time, a hardcore Deep South Dixiecrat state, appear to be so different for a while? What made Alabama exceptional was that in the 1940s, it was the most unionized state in the South. Union membership had increased from approximately 70,000 in 1933 to over 200,000 in 1945. Over 25%. I think I've got some slides here. Let's see. Over 25% of the labor force in that year. And to put this in perspective, there is no state in the United States today that has higher union membership than Alabama had in 1945. The Alabama labor movement was centered in the Birmingham area, the stronghold of the interracial United Mine Workers. They were the vanguard of the labor movement, and they helped in the organization of workers across the state, including steel workers, iron ore workers, woodworkers, textile workers, school teachers, and even principals in one county. So the strength of the labor movement made things different. There were factory workers organized in industrial towns, including Gadsden and Huntsville, Alabama, workers in shipbuilding. The Tennessee Valley Authority centered in Muscle Shoals was unionized, and longshoremen in Alabama, 95% of whom were Black, were organized, including those in Mobile, Alabama's largest port. And unionized areas during the 1930s and 1940s consistently supported more liberal, pro-labor, non-segregationist candidates like Folsom, as well as voicing opposition to poll taxes, which disenfranchised white workers, as well as virtually all Blacks. This high level of union membership in Alabama is suggestive of the degree to which further unionization of Alabama and the South as a whole might have politically transformed the region. And coal miners organized wall to wall. So that meant that in the 6 coal mining counties in northern Alabama, they organized everybody else. They organized woodwork workers, they organized textile workers, they organized washerwomen, they organized school principals even in a couple of counties. And the textile workers in Alabama were the earliest to organize in the South, and they were the vanguard of events leading up to the 1934 textile general strike, and they were by far the strongest contingent in the South. Southern workers successfully organized during the 1930s and 1940s in a large number of industries, including all Southern coal miners were organized, metal mining, longshore, auto, steel, oil, meat slaughtering, farm equipment, and others. And they extended their gains throughout the South, including a number of important Southern industrial centers, not only in Alabama, Memphis, Tennessee, as Mike Honey writes about, New Orleans, Atlanta, Laurel, Jackson, and Natchez, Mississippi. In Laurel, Mississippi, a town of 30,000 inhabitants, the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, had more than 6,000 members. And in late 1946, the Textile Workers Union, which had a great deal of difficulty in the South in general, won an election at the Laurel Textile Mill, which was the last major non-union plant in town. And this victory came despite the fact that openly white supremacist Senator Theodore Bilbo and Representative John Rankin came to town specifically to campaign against the union. And unlike the auto workers' defeat at Volkswagen in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 2014, this didn't stop the majority of white workers there from voting overwhelmingly for the CIO. Yet, as I document in the book, unions were defeated in the 2 largest Southern industries, textile and wood, and in other places, their unions often degenerated into tepid organizations, failing to challenge the racist status quo. And none of this was predetermined. So what is the end result of this? See, I think I have a slide here. So that also left the civil rights movement when it emerged in the 1950s, although it existed in the 30s and 40s when the labor movement was strong. During the 1950s, when it reemerged again, and we can look, the unions were much weaker than they had been, and there was not much support, particularly among white workers in the South, for civil rights. So the time frame goes sort of like this. 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education, mandating an end to segregation in schools. There was massive resistance and violence in the South. The civil rights movement was largely isolated, and the failures of the labor movement led almost directly to inability to combat this violence. As with previous racist movements in the South, it was led and organized by economic and political white elites, starting in the Mississippi Delta, majority African-American cotton plantation areas. It also drew support from working class and poor whites. The massive resistance was led by the White Citizens Council, terror was widespread, with the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, making open raids on Black communities throughout the South, injuring and killing many. In Birmingham, Klansmen castrated a Black handyman as part of a ceremony. In Camden, South Carolina, they flogged a white school teacher who had supported desegregation. In Gaffney, South Carolina, they dynamited the home of a white physician, and there are hundreds more cases like this. Blacks were beaten for no reason at all. Murders that went unpublished were ubiquitous. The most notorious case being that of 14-year-old Emmett Till, who was kidnapped, beaten, and killed for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Economic repression was even more widespread, and for those who challenged white supremacy, white and Black, they could be fired, denied credits, loans, mortgages, or being prevented from running a business, and this was the order of the day. And the isolated areas where interracial unions were strong were not able to be repressed, but they were too small to have undermined and challenged this movement. So the Republican Party set out to win racist whites in the South in order to expand its base, which had traditionally been that of the Democratic Party. This approach was pushed strongly in 1961. And I think I've got some slides here. Let's see. This slide I should have shown before. So the civil rights movement really takes off with the student sit-ins that begins in Greensboro, North Carolina, February 1st, 1960. Here's a picture of the lunch sit-in. And in 1964, when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was trying to organize Mississippi, these were three civil rights martyrs, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, who were murdered and found in a town called Philadelphia, Mississippi. So the Republicans went on to win the support of racist whites in the South. Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign was, according to commentators, a barely veiled attempt to appeal to racial hatred. His all-white rallies, especially in the South, made it possible for, and I'm quoting, unapologetic white supremacists to hold great carnivals of white supremacy. Sound familiar? Parallel to Goldwater and the Republican strategy were the 1964 and 1968 racist populist campaigns of Alabama Governor George Wallace. Well, Wallace had tremendous support among whites in the South. In the 1964 Democratic presidential primaries, he got 34% of the vote in Wisconsin, 30% in Indiana, and 43% in Maryland, including the majority of the white vote in that state. Democrats and Republicans took notice, and Nixon in 1968 tried to appropriate in veiled form the racist Wallace message. And Wallace seemed to have strong support in 68, but he lost it, and most of that support went to Nixon. Nixon's strategist, in a fascinating book, Kevin Phillips, wrote on how the Republican Party could become the majority party by winning the support of racist whites in the South. And so this was the Republican strategy. Ronald Reagan, who people extol that the party has somehow moved away from, campaigned against Black crime, welfare queens, and forced busing, and he kicked off his 1984 re-election campaign and also his 1980 campaign after the convention in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was the site of the 1964 kidnapping and murder of the three civil rights martyrs who I just mentioned. George H.W. Bush ran racist Willie Horton, This is Reagan in 1980 and 1984 in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And George H.W. Bush did the, whoops, got a blank screen here, let me see. Ran ads tying the case of a black rapist to Democratic presidential candidate Michael Dukakis, who had been released in Massachusetts on weekend passes. And this was supposedly Dukakis's position on crime, too lenient on crime, clearly racist ads. And this allowed, this turned the tide and allowed Bush, who's being extolled as the humanitarian Republican alternative to Donald Trump these days. And this continued in 1990, Louisiana Republican campaign KKK and Nazi leader David Duke to the 2016 presidential election of the racist xenophobic Donald Trump. The GOP message and strategy has been consistent. And so I argue that Donald Trump is the end line of a fairly consistent approach and strategy, perhaps more extreme in his rhetoric, but nothing out of the ordinary from this. Democrats themselves were not blameless, although their strategy was more complex given that their need to maintain minority support. Yet the signs were there, the veiled appeals were there. Jimmy Carter's calls in 1976 for racial purity, the attacks by the Chicago Democratic machine, racist attacks on 1983 Democratic mayoral candidate Harold Washington. President William Clinton's campaign and presidency reached new lows from his 1992 attacks on Sister Souljah, maybe before many people's time here, to his ordering as governor of, he was still governor of Arkansas when he was running the execution of a black mentally deficient death row prisoner to prove that he was tough on crime. His support for the gutting of welfare programs and a successful push for an omnibus crime bill whose draconian penalties fell disproportionately on Black youth and are in good part responsible for the criminal justice system today. So these policies, while the rhetoric was different, were hardly distinguished from the policies, the racist ones of the Republicans. And the failures and successes of Southern labor organizing in the 1930s and 1940s remain, I suggest, the key to understanding the trajectory of not just American politics, but much of contemporary society as well. These failures, I have argued, were not inevitable. Greater success could have led to a broader, more effective labor civil rights movement during the 1950s and 1960s, one that might have won the support of large numbers of white as well as Black and other minority workers, and thus creating possibilities for transforming not merely the South, but the United States as a whole. Let me just take a couple minutes at the end to talk about the South today. Southern economy has vastly changed since the 1930s and 1940s. Coal has virtually disappeared. It's not coming back. Textile production is gone. Basic steel is mostly gone, although certain types of steel fabrication remain, including in the South. Yet the South has a far greater economic dynamism than it ever had during the 1930s and 1940s. It has a large number of economically vital cities, including Miami, Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, Austin, Charlotte, Memphis, many others, multiracial, multi-ethnic, containing large numbers of African American, Latino, white, and other types of workers. It's an increasingly expanding arena for auto production, especially among foreign transplants, foreign companies that have their production facilities in the South, as well as a growing center for auto parts production, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Alabama. Oil and other energy production are still important there, and with new industries like the catfish farms in Mississippi, chicken, pork growing and processing, and other food production, aerospace, whatever. And so what we've seen, particularly in the current period, but in the last few years, something of a labor upsurge taking place, much of it in the South. So budget cuts, particularly in Republican-dominated states, have so impacted government workers, especially school teachers. Let's see what I got here. So we've had large numbers of militant strikes taking place among school teachers. West Virginia comes to mind. I think I have a picture, let's see, of Oklahoma, which is a southern state. These are teachers occupying the state capitol in the recent period. There are large numbers of logistic hubs in the South, including in Memphis and Louisville. Logistic hubs are the centers for the new, or a center of distribution centers for the new e-economy. So these includes warehouses, transportation, sorting of materials, mailing, etc. And those working in warehouses, food delivery, and other vital occupations whose importance has been underscored during the pandemic seem to be gaining new collective energy and militancy, striking over safeties. And a lot of the recent wave of strikes have been reported in Jacobin, Labor Notes, The Nation, and certain online venues. According to last Wednesday's New York Times, in the over 100 meat processing plants, many of them in the South, there have been 44,000 cases, COVID cases, and over 200 deaths. Workers, the possibilities for a new Southern labor upsurge certainly seem to be on the agenda. And the emergence of a new labor movement does not seem inconceivable. So I'll stop right there. I'm interested in knowing what type of questions or comments people might have. So Alex, back to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for, again, sharing your time and your most recent work. I think, this talk today really does a great job of sort of diagnosing, where we are right now vis-a-vis where we are or where we've been historically. And I think, your work really establishes this fantastic through line that works to really recover a history that, like you said, was not in any way, shape, or form predetermined or inevitable, right? Through your Alabama example. So I think, even though this history is unflattering, it kind of illustrates or illuminates an opportunity for change, or maybe to learn from our past mistakes, even during a moment culturally where I think, as you've done a good job identifying, we seem to be sort of destined to repeat some of these mistakes. So we've got a couple questions on the chat board, which I want to get to, and a number of questions that were submitted ahead of time. And Michael, I don't know if everybody can see that, but it looks like you're still screen sharing. I might be able to.
Let me get rid of this then.
Oh, I think I just got it. There you go.
Okay, great.
Excellent. So a couple questions one of which was about Operation Dixie and why it failed. Could you maybe talk for a moment about, I guess, what is Operation Dixie for those members of the audience who are unfamiliar with it, and sort of why it didn't work?
Sure. So Operation Dixie was the attempt after World War II of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, to organize the South. And since they had organized most of Northern industry, and they presumably had more resources and were ready to hit the South. And I believe that the defeat of Operation Dixie was really key to understanding what had happened to the labor movement, not only in the South, but in the country as a whole. And when I started looking at this is when I met Mike Honey, and we were both interested in Operation Dixie. And I even somewhat embarrassingly wrote during this period in the 1990s that this was really the key to transforming American politics, the defeat of Operation Dixie. But as I researched it, I came to the conclusion that it had not been a serious attempt to organize the South, that what seemed like a lot of resources was just a fraction of the resources that had been put into organizing two industries during the 1930s, steel successfully and textile unsuccessfully. They also appointed the most conservative, hesitant leaders to run Operation Dixie. They focused on textile, which was probably a mistake. It was an all-white industry that was more difficult to organize than, for example, woodworkers. And then in an industry that was almost half female, they appointed no female organizers. And the list goes on. It's sort of a menu or a lesson on how not to organize. So my conclusion was that it was not that serious an attempt to organize, not very competently done. Oh, and one other thing, among the most successful organizers in the South had been left-wing organizers, and they pretty much excluded them from the organizing staffs.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that sort of speaks to Andrew's question on the chat board about the textile industry too. I was curious, and we got a couple questions submitted ahead of time about sort of the prehistory here, and how the Great Depression, World War II, how those national and global events impacted the ability to organize the South during this era.
The sort of generals, but let me start with in September and October of 1929, the stock market crashed, and was a signal event for the depression, for the worldwide depression. Workers were laid off. They didn't really keep very good unemployment statistics. It's estimated that as many as 25 or 30% of the workforce was unemployed by the early 30s. Workers were stunned, but various social movements, including movements of the unemployed, surged up in virtually every city, and in some rural areas, but in virtually every city in the United States. And when I say rural areas, mining areas like the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, the state where I'm in, had big unemployed movements. But coal miners kept organizing and striking during the early 1930s. They were the first workers to organize, even before any enabling legislation took place. And I argue this in the book, in contrast to most scholarship that says the laws helped. So I don't put much stock in laws being passed, helping people organize, that the laws that are progressive almost always follow the organizing. And once the coal miners organized, that was a signal to most everybody else. 1934, there were dramatic strikes that struck the imagination of workers across the country. There was general strike in San Francisco, led by longshoremen. There was a Teamster strike in Minneapolis, led by Trotskyist truck drivers. And there were radicals in Toledo at the Autolite strike. The National Guard was called out. 30,000 members of unemployed organizations descended on the area and helped defeat the National Guard and help the workers win the strike. So there were massive struggles taking place, and labor union growth, as I've argued earlier, tends to take place in waves and snowballs. In down periods, workers are not feeling very confident, but once dramatic strikes start taking place, these things tend to spread like wildfire. So a series of years, several years during the 1930s, the strike wave continued to a huge amount. So union membership went from less than 3 million, the beginning of 1933, to probably 15 million or so by the end of World War II. And then certainly since the early 1950s, union growth, particularly unionization as a percentage of workers organized, has pretty much declined. This trend did not take place worldwide. In many countries, including Canada, unions kept growing through the 1960s. Certainly in the past 20 years, there are very few developed countries where unions have continued to grow. Most of them have suffered major declines. So worldwide, unions tend to be in Europe, Australia, and elsewhere tend to be weak, following the path of the United States. I'm not sure, is that the global sweep that we're looking for?
That was a pretty big question, but yeah, I think that response was fantastic. We did a couple more questions coming on the chat board, but there was one submitted ahead of time, which I was really interested in, particularly in light of what you've written about the mine workers and the ILWU. And the question was more about unions in general, and how would you describe, or I would say, what do strong unions provide both their members and their communities, and what makes sort of good unions unique in terms of how they see their larger mission? And you think, in 2020, do unions need to sort of reimagine how they see themselves and how they serve not only their members but the general public?
So there's a tendency among interracial unions to be more solidaristic. That isn't always the case, but leadership was very important. So the farm equipment workers in Louisville, which is sort of on the edge of the South, Louisville, Kentucky, the International Harvester local there which is written about in a dissertation, but also in a just recently released book by Tony Gilpin, was a overwhelmingly white local, left-wing leadership, very militant on civil rights. They desegregated everything in the plant, where there were separate lunchrooms, washrooms, lockers. They fought for upgrading Black workers to better jobs. And they also sent interracial groups, sometimes hundreds of people, integrating hotels, parks, even swimming pools in the Louisville area. One local that's still at it is Local 10 of the Longshoremen in San Francisco. They refused to load ships during the apartheid era. They recently had a one-day strike supporting Black Lives Matter. So there's still, that local is still at it. So these are the types of what I would call civil rights unionism. In 1946, this local fought for upgrading of bus drivers. And before the civil rights movement, virtually all bus and transportation workers in the country, north as well as south, were white. The longshoremen fought for hiring of black bus drivers. The first black bus driver was beaten up by racists. So the local sent 4 or 5 longshoremen to ride the bus with this driver, and that ended the violence. So the possibilities for unions that are civil rights oriented to deal with violent white supremacists seems to me is very important. And there are lots of other examples. There just was not enough. And this approach was abandoned by the so-called liberal mainstream unions. It was banned by the United Auto Workers, it was banned by the steel workers. I have a lot in the book about the steel workers. We could also write a book about the abandonment of militancy and civil rights activities by the auto workers as well.
Excellent. We've actually, next week, Peter Cole is going to be zooming in to talk about, organizing on the waterfront in the.
Right. So Peter documents a lot of this stuff about particularly Local 10. So that's something to look forward to.
Excellent. I thought in the sample you provided for my students, your the way you talked about the Tandy Area Council out of St. Louis.
St. Louis,
yeah, it's really, I mean, it's a vision that exceeds, the well-being of just their membership, right?
So this was also true. I was in Chicago as a student, and the headquarters of the United Packing House Workers, which was another left-oriented interracial union, as well as the Farm Equipment Workers International Harvester plants in Chicago. And these two unions led civil rights activity in the cities in the city in the 50s and 60s, as well as earlier in the 40s, 30s and 40s as well. So that tradition, not big enough, but still existed, and it's important to note what they did.
I see we've got a question from Mike Honey on the discussion board about what we should take away from this current moment in terms of organizing interracial progressive unionism. And if I could tack something on to that question that was submitted by a student too, thinking of, trying to find it, looking back on this summer, summer of protests for economic and racial justice, do you see, unions repeating the mistakes of the past, or have we learned lessons from the 30s and the 40s?
Yeah, I mean, my view is that unions have to be transformed. So the protests were inspirational, and I believe, even though they were reported on in the media, very underreported. It seems to me, from looking at states and things around, that there were tens of millions of people in the streets, more than was reported. And if you look at individual states, and I've looked at 3 or 4 of them, there were thousands upon thousands of protests. I've seen documentation for several hundred in Michigan alone, and this includes all white areas in northern Michigan, and the one of the more interesting ones was in Sterling Heights, which is considered a racist area, all white area outside Detroit, referred to even by the people who live there as Sterling Whites. 10,000 people shut down the downtown supporting Black Lives Matter. So this took place all over. On the other hand, we saw very little union presence in any of these demonstrations, right? So if it was the 1930s or 1940s, you would have seen thousands of union members with their banners and shirts from their union marching in support. And we saw very little of that. I was hoping that we would see more. And I think that in general, unions have to be transformed to have more of a broader consciousness of what solidarity means, both inside the workplace, but also in terms of the society at large. Hopefully we'll see that as it emerges.
Well, do you have time for one final question?
I have all day, so.
Or several more final questions. And I don't mean to stoke everyone's anxiety in the Zoom call, but we had a number of questions submitted ahead of time, imagining sort of what if scenarios after tomorrow, or in all likelihood after whenever we find out the results from the election. But there were also some questions submitted on the chat board about Jimmy Carter's reference to ethnic purity. And so I'm kind of, I guess, trying to package these together. To what degree is this is sort of, the eliminations of unions at a national level, one of the few things that seems to have bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats. And what do you anticipate, since we've at least seen 4 years of Trump, in the event of a Biden presidency? Is this going to be a major victory for unions, or just sort of a reversion to the new norm, which is a gradual chipping away at union power?
Yeah, so although Trump is obviously pretty horrible, I put no stock in the Democrats making any major transformation of any kind of the country. When they've had majorities, they've never passed labor law reform. It didn't take place under Carter. It didn't take place under Obama. So the expectations that they would do anything that would help unions are misplaced. Both of them, and I've quoted in several things Gore Vidal, who's sort of an iconoclastic anti-establishment liberal, said that there's only one party in the United States, the party of capital, and it has two right wings. So I think that gains that have to be made by labor have to be made by militancy, by organizing, by striking. The laws were much more inhospitable to unions in the early 1930s than they are today. People have to organize. And I was in a union, the auto workers, which claimed to be for all sorts of things, never did any organizing and has pretty much declined continuously since the 1970s in terms of membership. So there has to be a transformation of the labor movement, and it's up to workers themselves to organize and not have any expectations that the Democrats will be helpful or and return to normal doesn't necessarily help people in terms of labor organizing, workers' safety. OSHA, and I think it's a myth to think that these things, bad things, have all happened under Trump. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and the agency were gutted from the beginning. Democrats never did anything to expand it. Lack of safety, whether it be mines or other workplaces, existed under Democrats and Republicans. So these things have to be taken charge of by workers themselves.
Okay, I see in the comments, someone's mentioned, it seems the two-party system no longer works, or it's working perfectly, right?
It's working for some people, but not for most of us. Back to the growing inequality and the disparities in terms of the super rich and the percentage of the economy that they own, control, and the wealth of the country has continued pretty much since the early 1970s. It's more extreme in this country than in other countries, but it's bad throughout the whole developed and even the underdeveloped world, less developed world. So the normalcy is working. The rich get bailed out. That was true at the that was true at the first CARES Act that was passed by Congress. The only, as far as I can tell, there were only 3 Democrats who opposed the bill because it was a corporate giveaway. In the House, it was only AOC who opposed it. The other 3 members of the so-called squad voted in favor of it and didn't say anything. In the Senate, it was just Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren who criticized the bill as being corporate giveaway. But I think that was the same thing that took place in 2008 when the Democrats controlled the presidency in both houses of Congress, that it was largely a giveaway from the banks. It didn't help keep people whose mortgages were underwater from losing their homes and whatnot. So I don't see why we should have any expectation that things are going to be different this time without massive organizing.
Yeah, it's that myth of trickle-down economics has been remarkably persistent despite a long history of it not actually working.
Right.
So with that said, there's one final question that I wanted that was raised here in the chat room, and it has to do with candidates like Bernie Sanders, AOC, the squad. Do you think I guess I'm asking you to put on your prognostication cap. Do you think we're going to see an increasing number of further left of center Democratic voices emerging, and is that going to be able to drag the Democratic establishment to the left?
Well, you want me to make some prediction? Well, first of all, I don't think the Democratic establishment is going to be dragged towards the left. They get their my assessment of the election is that the ruling class has become disgusted with Trump. While initially corporate deregulation of industry, huge tax cuts was something that many in the corporate world were in favor of, his handling of the pandemic, his reaction to Black Lives Matter, which many corporations seem to be willing to do cosmetic things that don't cost them anything. If you want to expropriate a large amount of their wealth to rebuild the cities and to do all the things that need to bring people up out of the dire situations that they're in, they wouldn't, and the Democrats wouldn't support that either. I think that out of frustration, there may be more people left-leaning elected, but that again seems to be mostly cosmetic. The idea of transforming the Democratic Party, I believe, is a lost cause. That we need a party that is not tied to certain capitalist interests like the Democratic Party is. a working class party that puts forward a much more radical agenda. But I think out of frustration, you tend to see more of these left-leaning candidates get support and be organized. I mean, we've seen a couple in this last round of primaries. We may see more in the future.
Excellent. Well, with that said, thank you again so much for sharing your time, your expertise. This was a really great talk, and again, I can't encourage audience members enough to check out your newest book, which is absolutely fantastic.